Hey everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. For our journey through the New Testament, we are on Mark chapter 5 today. If you're new to this study, just know that there are free notes for all of this material out on our website, 2BeLikeChrist.com, link down in the description below. It's also a free ebook for new Bible students down there. You can go off or get a hard copy on Amazon.com, whichever you like. Remember, if maybe you'd like to listen to this on podcast, that's available to you as well. You can get it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, a bunch of them. Just search 2BeLikeChrist. That's 2 with the number 2. All right, we're talking about Mark chapter 5 today. And this is coming right after chapter 4, where Jesus gives the parable of the sower, the parable of the mustard seed, and then he calms the storm on Galilee. So that's kind of where we're picking up. Jesus was in that boat, he calms the sea, and then he's getting off the boat when we enter chapter 5. They came to the other side of the sea in the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with chains. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. So as we mentioned, Jesus is on the boat, and he comes to this area called the Gerasenes. If you look at Matthew's record, you'll see this called the Gadarenes. Same place, but a different name. Many people believe that this was an area that was located on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, over by the area of the Golan Heights. There's a couple reasons people think that it's in that area. Not only archaeological evidence, but also, if you were with us for our Matthew study, we talked about the Golan Heights and how there was a significant wind that came off of that area into the Sea of Galilee. So that would kind of explain the windstorm that Jesus would have just gone through with his apostles. So thinking that's the area. There's a map there in your notes that highlights the area of the Golan Heights there in green, and then you'll see Gergesa in the red square. And that's where we think, the area where we think Jesus was. And if you look on Google Maps, you can actually see that there are several steep banks in this area that lead down into the Sea of Galilee. And that'll be important as we continue on reading through the story. And this was an area that is thought to have largely been inhabited by Gentiles. In the text, you'll notice that the people who lived there were pig herdsmen. Wait, did we read that, or is that not till later? Okay, we haven't read that yet. That's a little bit later on. But you'll find out that they are pig herdsmen. And that would be really strange if a Jew was a pig herdsman, because pigs, they couldn't eat pigs, right? Pigs were considered an unclean animal. So this was almost certainly Gentiles who were doing this, or else they were just really bad, rebellious Jews. But probably Gentiles. So upon reaching the land, Jesus got out of the boat, and he immediately met a man with an unclean spirit, or a demon. Matthew says that there were 2 men in Matthew chapter 8, verse 28, but here we find Mark just focusing on the one particular of these 2. And I wanted to include this little section about demons that I added in the Matthew study, just for anyone who wasn't with us in that study, but know that all those notes are out there also on the website if you'd like to go through the book of Matthew. And just talk about a few of the characteristics of the demons and what exactly this was, because I understand that if you're new to the Bible and you're reading this, you're like, this is really strange. And even those of us who are familiar with the Bible, this is still kind of strange. So when the Bible talks about demons and demon possession, what is it talking about? Well, Mark chapter 3, verse 23, we can understand that the demons were either sent by Satan, or they were at least in league with Satan, and were kind of doing the same work. These demons appeared to have minds of their own, and they spoke to Jesus, and they had knowledge of Jesus that their host didn't have. We see that in Mark chapter 5, verse 29, which we'll read about. This demon recognizes Jesus, even though Jesus hadn't revealed himself yet to the world. Mark's account mentions that this particular demon has given his host a supernatural strength. in verse 4, where he's able to break these chains and no one can bind him. We know that the demons could inhabit animals. We'll see that a little bit later on in this chapter. The Jews in the Bible appear to be somewhat familiar with this. And when Jesus comes on the scene, they seem to already have some familiarity with people who have been possessed by demons. Outside of the early years of the church, I'm not aware of any biblical references to casting out demons. Not sure if that's because they just aren't mentioned and the Bible wants to focus on something else, or if towards the end of the first century, these demon possessions are not happening in the same way that they were during the ministry of Jesus. We'll keep an eye on that as we go throughout the New Testament text. It's possible that Zechariah chapter 13, verse 2 refers to the disappearance of evil spirits after the time of the Messiah and the establishment of the church. So you can check that out if you want to. Some people equate evil spirits with mental illness today. I've heard that quite a bit. And personally, I don't equate the two, largely because of what we've seen in the facts that we've just examined. There's definitely some things there that are not necessarily things that we witness today with just mental illness. And my personal opinion is that demon possession does not exist in the modern world, that it was something that happened and was permitted by God during the time of Christ and the early church, perhaps to show God's superiority over Satan, but that it no longer is present today. But I'm open to evidence and discussion on that, but that's the position that I hold currently based on my study of the scriptures. And this man, back in our text, who was possessed, it says he ran wild through the tombs and no one had the ability to bind him. And he spent his days crying out and cutting himself with stones. So now we'll read a little bit more about the story, verses 6 through 13. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Although Jesus hasn't yet revealed his identity as the Messiah to the general public, we see here that this demon knows who Jesus is. And the relationship that Christ and God and the spiritual beings in heaven have with the demons is not something that we are really privy to, but evidently this demon knows more than just your average Joe on the street. And it's interesting here that he comes to Jesus and he puts up no resistance. He knows that Jesus is superior to him, and that Jesus can send him wherever he wants to send him, and that he can't resist God's commands. And so he begs Jesus not to torment him in verse 7, which is an interesting statement. In Matthew, the demon is quoted as saying, or asking along with this, "Have you come here to torment us before the time?" And the question is, what is the time? Well, it's probably a reference to the day of judgment, as far as we can infer and guess. Probably a reference to the day of judgment when all of the demons are going to be punished, right, along with Satan. Hell is a place prepared for Satan and his angels. And the demon knew, interestingly, the eventual fate. And I find that interesting because the demon knows that he can't resist God. He knows his ultimate fate. And so my question is, why resist God? I mean, why continue resisting God if you know that you're not going to win? And that torment is your eventual fate that you're just waiting around for until the end of time. Why is that? And I thought about that, and maybe it's just because the demon wanted to do his own thing, wanted to live his own way instead of the way that God would rather it live, if demons even have that choice. Again, there's a lot we don't know here. But the demon obviously believed in God, right? He knew that he wasn't a match for God, but he also knew that Judgment Day wasn't here yet. He's like, are you coming to torment me ahead of time? Because, you're not supposed to do that until the end of time. He knew Judgment Day was coming, but he knew it wasn't here yet. And he probably didn't know that Jesus was going to show up that day. Demons aren't all-knowing. And he sees Jesus come on his shoreline, and it's a surprise, probably, that Jesus has arrived there. And I began to think about that and our attitudes for why we resist God. There's a lot of people who believe in God, and they know that they're no match for him. They know that someday they're probably going to stand before him in judgment and have to give an answer for their lives. And it's not like they're going to trick him or be powerful enough to escape his wrath. And yet, they're living their life their own way because they don't necessarily want to live the way that God instructs them to live. And and like maybe this is the case with this demon, is that unfortunately some of those people who may think, well, I have time, Judgment Day's not here yet, right? Some of those people, unfortunately, like this demon may have, end up meeting Jesus before they expect. And so they're rebellious because they don't expect to meet Jesus that day. And some of them, unfortunately, end up meeting him sooner. But I thought there were some interesting parallels there with this demon acknowledging that torment is his destiny, but still living in rebellion to God. There's a lot of people who I think would acknowledge that torment is their destiny if they don't straighten out their lives, and yet they're still living in rebellion to God. So just know, if you're in that position, that the future is not bright if you remain in that position, and don't assume that you're going to have a full life ahead of you before you have to go to Judgment Day, because Jesus could come back, or you could meet Jesus if you die an untimely death earlier than expected. And so don't put off the decision to get right with God. Maybe our motivations for doing wrong aren't always a whole lot different than this demon, and our assumptions are not a whole lot different than this demon. Jesus asked the demon its name, and who knew demons have names, but he says, my name is Legion, or our name is Legion, for we are many. This man who's been oppressed, it seems that he might be oppressed by more than one demon, and that these demons are speaking through a representative to Christ. Pretty creepy, right? But that seems to be what's going on. The demons know Jesus would not allow them to remain in this man, and curiously, they make this request to go into the pigs, this herd of pigs, about 2,000 of them on this cliff. And even more curiously, Jesus obliges them. And when Jesus had banished the demon out of the man, the demons entered into these pigs, and they all ran down the steep cliff and drowned in the sea. And I think that just leaves us with so many questions about what's going on in this picture. And I think there's a good application here, a good lesson to be learned here, and that is that God doesn't always satisfy all of our curiosities. And I know that personally, as someone who's teaching the Bible, there's a temptation for me to want to fill in all those gaps. But the best that I can really do to fill those in is just to speculate about them. And there's so much that I don't know. There's so much going on in the spiritual world with the relationship between Jesus and these demons that it's not made available to me, that information. And so I think I could actually do more harm here speculating and trying to fill in those gaps than just being willing to say, we don't know. And I think that's in some cases the best option for a Bible teacher to take is we don't know. God, if he had felt that we needed to know, would have filled in some of those details for us, but he didn't. And so clearly they're not, something that's super duper important for us. And it's okay for us to say, you know what, I'm a human being. I don't know what goes on in the spiritual realm all the time and why all of these events took place and why Jesus lets them go into the pigs. And I don't know. And I think that's okay. That's a better answer than coming up with all kinds of harebrained ideas about, that probably aren't even correct, and maybe misinforming people and leading them in a bad direction rather than just having the humility to say, we don't know. So a lesson there, I think, to be learned. Verses 14 through 17. The herdsmen, here's the herdsman I was talking about earlier, fled and told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. The pig herdsmen go back into the city and they start to tell everyone. And upon hearing, all the people come out to see Jesus and to see this man who's been healed. No doubt this man had quite a reputation in the community. And when they saw the man healed, the Bible says that they were afraid and they asked Jesus if he would leave. And kind of a strange response, at least in my opinion. Why are they afraid? That's kind of the question that I would have. Why are they afraid? I mean, this seems like it would be a blessing. And yet they're afraid, and then they ask Jesus to leave. Why? I thought we aren't told exactly. I don't think that we have any record of Jesus saying one way or another whether them asking him to leave was a good or a bad thing. And so I thought of at least 3 reasons why it's possible that they may have been afraid and asked Jesus to leave. And so we can put these out there to mull over in our minds if we want to. But number 1, first reason they might be afraid and ask Christ to leave is that they were afraid that he'd cause more damage to their livelihood. Right? Pretty straightforward. They'd already lost 2,000 pigs that day. They were all now very moist pigs drown in the Sea of Galilee. And they're like, you know what? We don't want any. That's enough damage for one day. Please leave our country. That could have been a reason. Number 2 was that they may have just been overwhelmed with the miracle and by the miracle. They didn't know what they were dealing with. They didn't know who this man was. They knew that he was powerful, obviously, because he had cast out the demon in this man that nobody else could help. But rather than taking any time to get to know Jesus, they asked him to leave so that their lives could just return to normal. Basically, they were saying, we don't know what's going on here, but we don't want to be involved. Please just leave our country. And there are people like that. They just want their lives to be quiet and peaceable and never disturbed. And anything that disturbs them, they don't necessarily, or they're not necessarily curious about what it is or why it's the case, but they just want to go back to their comfortable, quiet lives and not be involved. And maybe that's why they asked Jesus to leave and they were afraid, didn't know what they were dealing with. And then the third reason is that maybe this was a proper fear of God. I don't know that there's any, as I mentioned, I don't know that there's any talk or discussion or statements by Jesus that suggest or that condemn them for sending him out of the country. Could be wrong about that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that there is. And Strong's Concordance says that this word for afraid can be understood as to be in awe or to revere someone. And so it may have been the case that they didn't feel worthy of Jesus' presence. They knew he was a great man, powerful, and they felt like we don't deserve we're not fit for you to be in our presence. Kind of like Peter, after Jesus had worked the miracles, sending the fish into his net in Luke chapter 5, verse 8. Peter says, it fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." He asks him to leave because he feels like Jesus shouldn't be in his presence. Maybe that could have been what the sentiment was here in Mark chapter 5. Again, we're not told exactly, but some things to think about. Verse 18 through 20 now. "And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, 'Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you.' And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled." So Jesus is leaving at the request of the people, and the man he healed came and begged him that he could go with him in the boat, and Jesus doesn't permit it. He actually tells the man to go into the city, go to his home, go to his friends, and tell everybody about what Jesus had done for him. I thought there was an interesting lesson and application that maybe we could take from this, and that is that this man probably thought that the best route for his life was to go with Jesus. That seems like a pretty reasonable thing to think. The best thing that I could do with my new life is to follow Jesus around. And yet Jesus redirects him for what apparently was a greater purpose. And I think we can set our lives, or attempt to set our lives in a trajectory that we believe is the best option for us to accomplish the work that God has given us to do. We can be really convinced that this must be what I'm supposed to be doing. And sometimes God will come in and he will shift our direction so that he can use us for a greater purpose. And so we should be open to that this looks like it's the best option for me, but maybe God has something else and a better way to use me, and maybe he's going to accomplish more through me than I ever considered could be accomplished through me, because his plans are not always my plans. And one final thought on this passage, and this is more for you to chew on, I guess. I'm not sure that this is a connection that the author wants to make. I don't want to try to loosely connect this and draw some conclusion from it and say, oh yeah, the Mark definitely meant for you to look back at this passage and to think about this other passage. But consider at least the parallel between Mark chapter 3, verse 27 and this story. I don't know if Mark wants our minds to be drawn back to this or not, but there's definitely some interesting parallels. So in Mark chapter 3, Jesus is talking about his power over Satan to take what Satan possesses, and it's in that whole discussion of the blasphemy of the Spirit and him being accused of using Satan's power to cast out demons. And there's this statement that he makes, and that no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, and then indeed he may plunder his house. And Jesus is saying that he's the only one who's strong enough to bind the strong man, Satan, and to set free those who are enslaved in Satan's house. But think about the parallels in this picture. We have a man in the tombs who is under the power of Satan, and he's so strong that no one can bind him. And yet Jesus comes along, he binds him, figuratively, with his words, and then he sets him free. And he takes what belongs to Satan and casts Satan out. Again, I don't know if Mark is trying to draw us back to that verse or not, but parallels. Okay, verse 21 through 24. And this is we're going to shift from this story on to a few other healings that Jesus performs. And this time he's going to go back to Capernaum. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. I actually want to stop there and make an observation, and that is that this is not the only time that we find people anticipating Jesus at the seaside. You can imagine why they might be there. People would have probably come from all over the place, as they had been, to be healed, brought their sick people to Capernaum knowing that Jesus was there. And then they got there and someone says, oh, he took his boat and he went somewhere else, right? And what would you do if you were somebody who had made the journey? Well, you'd probably sit there and wait for him, right? And you can imagine these people who were sitting watching the horizon on the Sea of Galilee, waiting for Jesus's boat to pop up, because they knew that when that boat showed up on that horizon, that meant that Jesus was coming back to deliver them from their sicknesses or their pain or their suffering or whatever it was. And I thought about the way that we look for the coming of the Lord and what's our attitude towards Jesus coming back. Are we anxiously awaiting Jesus on the shore, the figurative shore, waiting for him to return to the earth so that he can take us away and take us all from all this suffering and pain? Are we anxious to see him come? Or are we in dread of seeing Jesus's arrival because we know our life isn't right? It's not what it should be. And then we're not going to have time to straighten it out, right? We want to be those people who are anxiously just can't wait for Jesus to come back. And in order to do that, our lives have to be right with him. And so if your life isn't right with him, I'd encourage you to do that. Where was I? Oh, verse 22. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So Jesus is back in Capernaum, and he's arrived to large crowds. And a man by the name of Jairus, who was a ruler in the synagogue, came and approached him and earnestly implored him that he would come to his house and he would heal his daughter, who was about to die. The text says that Jesus went with him. And it's easy to just kind of skip over those words and not think about maybe the scene and what that would look like. But let's think about that for a second. Jesus seems to respect bold requests, requests made in bold faith. And here, this man makes a request of bold faith. Jesus undoubtedly was at this point the most popular, most important man in all of Capernaum, for obvious reasons. And it probably would have taken Jairus some courage to approach Jesus and to ask him to follow him. Right? Jesus, I know you're the most important. I know you just got off that boat, but I need you to come to my house. I know all these other people, they probably want your time and your attention, but you need to come with me, right? Jairus probably would have thought, who am I to ask for Jesus' time? And there were probably plenty of other people who wanted Jesus' time, probably plenty of important people, other things that Jesus could have been doing. But Jesus rewards him by coming with him because he's willing to come up in faith and to make the request. And I wonder, if there's some application for us as far as praying boldly, knowing that we are children of God, that we have Jesus's ear, that he actually cares about us, and making bold requests. And we don't find that Jesus balks at boldness. He's more than willing to reward it, is the consistent message of the Gospels. Okay, verse 24 through 26. And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. Jesus is on the way to Jairus' house, and there's this woman, and says that she has a discharge of blood, and that this had been going on for 12 years. And this illness had caused her great suffering, that she had been to a bunch of physicians, and they had not been any help at all, and they had taken all her money. Well, she had spent all of her money trying to get better, and it wasn't working. And if this woman was a Jew, this ailment would have been particularly troubling. The reason for that is because this would probably have made her ceremonially unclean. There were some laws in the Old Testament about cleanliness. I think we talked about them in an earlier chapter of Mark, but she would have been ceremonially unclean, and that meant that she would have been excluded from a significant portion of Jewish life. And we may not think about what that would mean to a person, but let's take a few minutes to appreciate as much as possible and to sympathize as much as possible with the position that she may have been in. So being ceremonially unclean would have excluded her from things like eating the feasts, Passover and some of the Jewish religious feasts, and it would have excluded her from being allowed to go into the temple and many other things. If you want to read about all those laws about cleanliness, you can go back in, Numbers and Leviticus and read about them there. But and we, modern day, most of us, we don't have any kind of like religious feasts that we celebrate. But think about our holidays. There's definitely some feasting we do, especially if you're American. Thanksgiving or Christmas. All your family comes together and they get together and they have a big meal and the holidays are special for a lot of people. But imagine if you were ceremonially unclean and all of your family was getting together and everyone was invited to your parents' house or your house or something, and you couldn't go. You weren't welcome because of the condition that you were in. And you would have lived almost in a constant state of being unwelcome at places. Or imagine your church building that you had grown up in, that you loved people in, and you were ceremonially unclean, right? And you could no longer go back to that church building because you weren't welcome there. Obviously, those are illustrations, but I think communicate the emotional toll that bearing this burden would have had on a person. And, imagine if you were a leper and you were unclean. You had that disease and all the places that you were once welcome at. In an instant, when you received that diagnosis, all those invitations were revoked. And, even your loved ones, anyone, was off limits to you. So think about that. Put yourself in that with your own family and the things that you value, and try to get some appreciation for what these people would have been going through. And what's more is that it wasn't their fault, right? It wasn't this woman's fault that she had an issue or a discharge of blood. If you had leprosy, you didn't want to go get leprosy and put that on yourself. So that would have made it, I think, even harder, is that these people weren't unclean and sick because they wanted to be unclean and sick. So it was very much against their desire to be ostracized from society. But then imagine how much a miracle of healing would mean to these people. It would mean that you could go back to your family and go back to your place of worship and celebrate with all the other Jews who appreciated and participated and loved all of these traditions. It would have been the welcoming back, right? And it would have been tremendous, probably. In a spiritual sense, Jesus' healing of us is an opportunity to be welcome. And it's an opportunity to be welcomed in his church. So if you've thought about, maybe you've gone through your whole life and you've never felt like you were welcome anywhere, Jesus has made a place for you to be welcome when you come to him for healing of your sins. And obviously, the church is just a shadow of how great heaven is going to be for the children of God and the welcome and the invitation that everyone will have there. Verses 27 through 29. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garment, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So having heard about the power of Jesus, she determines that he is her best hope. And she makes her way through the crowd. And she's confident that if she can just touch Jesus' clothing, she's going to be healed. And she managed it. And her faith was confirmed in the fact that she could actually feel the healing going on in her body when she had touched his garment. And Jesus perceived in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in... Let me try that again. This is verse 30. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garment?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So Jesus immediately recognizes that power has gone out of him, which is an interesting way to say this. I think this is the only place where that type of language is used. Rather than an unclean person touching Jesus and him becoming unclean, the unclean person became clean. Rather than a leper touching Jesus and him getting leprosy, the leper became clean when he touched Jesus. And I think that's a powerful picture of the untarnishable purity and power of God come into the world, and really all that God represents in being the light of the world, the purity, the true picture of holiness, right? That he can't be tarnished in any way by earthly infirmities. Jesus asked the crowd, "Who touched me?" And the apostles are like, "What do you mean, who touched you? We're in a crowd of people." But Jesus had recognized that this was not just the regular old shoulder bump with somebody, that this was a touch of faith that was made for a purpose. And in fear, the woman comes and admits to what she's done. And Jesus tells her that there wasn't any reason to fear, and he commends her faith, and he speaks very kindly to her. Of course, Jesus knew who had touched him. So the question is, why does he ask? What's the point of that? What's the point of making the woman her identity public and exposing her? Well, a few reasons, maybe. Number one would be to bring glory to God. You got to remember, these towns were not like cities that we live in today, a lot of them. They were smaller towns. People didn't have cars to go all over the place. They couldn't go to Walmart 20 miles away, if they wanted a different place to shop. They were probably all shopping, going to the same stores, going to the same market. People probably would have known each other, at least on a semi-familiar level. And so how would this have brought glory to God by exposing this woman? Well, it may have been the case that people in this city knew this woman and her affliction, and they may have known that she had been to every doctor in that city, and none of them could cure her, but Jesus had cured her. It may have been that he wanted to give the people a picture of great faith, which the woman certainly had. Or I also thought he may have exposed the woman as a generosity to the woman. So imagine if you had an issue of blood, probably an unobservable disease to people from the outside world. It would probably be pretty suspicious if after 12 years this woman came and said, "Hey, I'm not unclean anymore. I'm perfectly clean," because she had probably had restrictions on her, and people would have known about those restrictions. And all of a sudden she's like, "Oh, I'm clean now." Who was going to believe her? Well, even if she could prove it to a priest, maybe she wouldn't be able to prove it to everybody else. And so Jesus may be pointing out to the crowds through his identification of this woman that this woman is now clean. And that probably would have saved her a lot of embarrassment, probably would have gotten that out, and everyone would have known it, and she could have gone on with her life, and people would have known that she was better. And they wouldn't have known that if she had just snuck off into the crowd. Potentially that's the reason. And just for a moment, compare the boldness of Jairus to the timidity of this woman. So Jairus comes and he's like, "Jesus, you need to come to my house." and the woman comes and she says that she comes up behind Jesus and touches his garment. in the most unobtrusive way of receiving healing probably ever, right? But I love the fact that Jesus honors the requests of both people. There are people who, with great boldness of faith, come to God and they know that they're children of God. They know that God will give them his ear because he loves them. And that's the way they pray and approach God with their requests or with their desires. And then there are also people who, in great humility, in great poverty of spirit, in knowing that they're undeserving of God listening to them, come more like this woman in her humility, her secrecy. And maybe for us, if you've been a Christian any length of time, you've probably come to God both ways, depending on things that are going on in your life and your spiritual walk, right? And I love that Jesus obliges both people and gives them both the healing that they're looking for. Talk about that a little bit later at the end of the chapter. Verse 35, we're almost there. While he was still speaking, Jesus, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." So Jesus is commending this woman, and while he's doing it, there's some people, messengers, who come from Jairus' house, and they say, "Jairus, you're too late. There's no reason to bother Jesus anymore. Your daughter has died." And we don't know Jairus' initial reaction. We're not told, but Jesus doesn't give him a whole lot of time to react. He looks at him and he says, "Don't fear, just believe." I'd like to see that, and the emotions on Jairus' face, the crowd around him, and the messengers who came. But that's what Jesus says. And to Jairus' credit, we have no indication that he did anything but believe. He doesn't grumble at this woman for slowing Jesus down and his daughter now being dead. The text just says that it doesn't say anything, right? But the impression that we get is that he trusted Christ. Verse 37 through 43 now. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. He arrives at his house, and Jesus only takes 3 of his apostles with him, Peter, James, and John, that inner circle. That they also get some special privileges to witness some other things in Jesus' ministry. But Jesus asks, he comes into the house and he finds these mourners, people who are weeping over the scene. And he asks them an interesting question. He says, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Scientifically, the mourners knew that the girl had died. But what they didn't know was that the creator of science and the conqueror of death was standing in front of them. And so their response was that they laughed at Jesus. And I don't think that they were right or that it was okay for them to laugh at Jesus, but I began to think, what would be my response if I was in that situation? And, they may not have known who Jesus was. Didn't know that he was famous, or they didn't know that he had the power over death, obviously, or they wouldn't have responded that way. But imagine you at a funeral, maybe for one of your loved ones, and a random guy comes in and says, "Why are you all crying? This man's not dead. Your loved one's not dead. He's just sleeping." What would be your response to a person like that? it almost would feel like disrespectful, right? And so I'm not so sure I wouldn't have responded the same way. Again, I'm not justifying that, but just out of human nature. It's interesting that they laughed when they heard about the resurrection. In Acts chapter 17, when Paul's preaching in Athens, the people mocked when they heard about the resurrection. There's a lot of people today that mock the idea of a bodily resurrection, that there's anything after this life is over. And I just think there's a lesson here that we would be wise to evaluate who's claiming power of resurrection before we laugh, because we may be laughing at our Creator, who is well able to raise the dead if he so chooses. Jesus obviously knew that this girl was dead, but he says that she was sleeping because he's going to wake her almost as if she was just taking a nap and sleeping. So he takes his little audience into this room, and the girl was laying there, and he takes her hand and he says, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Just as the Word of God had put life into all living things back in the creation account in Genesis, here Jesus puts life back into this girl with just a word. And I want you to consider just for a second the complexities of restarting a dead human body. I don't think we consider how complex that is. And I don't even have any real medical background, but I still know that that would be a crazy thing to pull off. Think about it. All the organs would be kickstarting at once. Function would have to come back to the brain, pushing blood through cold veins, restoring decayed organ tissue that had been starved of oxygen. Oxygen-starved muscles would have to get going, firing at full capacity again. Your eyes would have to redilate. Your blood pressure and your oxygen levels would have to stabilize. And then and the text says that she got up immediately and started walking around. And Jesus manages all of this complexity, not in a medical hospital, not with any other surgeons around. He doesn't even have a vitals machine. He just does it in a word. He says, arise, and it happens. And there's no, right? His power is enough to organize all of those complexities and to make this body work immediately. And there's not even side effects. It says that she gets up. She's not even dizzy after her heart's been stopped for who knows how long, and there hasn't been blood going to her brain. And she gets up and she starts walking around. And I think the statement that's made there, they were immediately overcome with amazement. That's probably not that probably is an understatement, but accurate, somewhat accurately portrays the way that these people would have felt. And again, we find Jesus telling them not to take this miracle public and to tell a bunch of other people. He's not yet ready to reveal his identity as the Messiah, and But contrast this with what he told the demon-possessed man earlier in the chapter. Why does he tell the demon-possessed man that he's supposed to go and tell everybody about the miracle, but he tells this person and other people that they're not supposed to tell anybody? And I'm not exactly sure yet. I hope to get a little bit more insight as we go through the Gospels, but it may have been the audience that he was addressing. The demon-possessed man, as we talked about, came from a likely Gentile-saturated area. We have other examples of Jesus telling Gentiles to go and tell others about him, like the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. Whereas here in this more Jewish context in Capernaum, Jesus is telling people not to say anything. So I'm not sure. I'll have to watch out for this, but it may be the case that Jesus is permitting the Gentiles to know a little bit more and to express what they know, to tell other people. He's allowing the Gentiles to do that, but to the Jews, he's more reserved. He's keeping more of this a secret. Maybe that's because his ministry is already in that area. I'm not exactly sure, but we'll watch out for that and see if that's a consistent pattern as we go throughout the rest of the Gospels. And I need to go back and check Matthew to see if that was consistent. Two additional observations from chapter 5 as we close. Again, take a moment to contrast the healing of the woman with the issue of blood with the healing of Jairus' daughter. Jairus had enjoyed 12 years with his daughter, right? She was 12 years old, probably 12 years that he enjoyed. The woman had been afflicted with the discharge of blood for 12 years. Jairus was probably an important man. He was the ruler of the synagogue. But this woman, probably not very important. We don't even know her name. Jairus probably had money because he was important. The woman didn't have any money because she had spent it all on doctors. Jairus approached Jesus with boldness and publicly, but the woman approached Jesus privately and in secret. Jairus wanted Jesus to physically come to his house and to heal his daughter. The woman only wanted her finger to graze the hem of Jesus' clothing, and he didn't even need to break stride to heal this woman. The healing of Jairus' daughter was delayed by Jesus' journey and by Jesus' choice to physically go, but the healing of the woman was immediate. Jairus' daughter was raised to life in a private room, but the woman was healed in the midst of a throng of people. And I don't know if there's anything deeper to all of these contrasts, but I do know that these stories are recorded together in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're always together. Maybe it's a picture of just the well-rounded nature of Jesus' ministry, that he's willing to help all kinds of people. I'm not exactly sure, but something to consider as you read these. And here's the last observation. Consider that Jesus delayed his arrival at Jairus' house, or at least he knew it would be delayed. Jesus knew exactly how much life that girl had in her when Jairus initially came to him, and he knew that if he decided to walk to Jairus' house, he would encounter the woman with the issue of blood, and his daughter would be dead by the time he got to the house. And I'm sure that Jairus was probably in a hurry, but Jesus wasn't. What's interesting is that this is not the only time we see Jesus doing this. In John chapter 11, Jesus actually delays going to his friend Lazarus' house, who's sick, until he's dead. And so Jesus makes kind of a pattern of this. And the Jews are curious about that. Lazarus' family is curious about why he does that. But he tells his apostles that he's glad that he wasn't there so that they may believe. So evidently, I think obviously to us, healing a sick person is pretty impressive, but raising a dead person, that's even more impressive. And it was an opportunity for them to observe that greater miracle and for their faith to be strengthened in a greater way. And I just wonder, and something to consider is it possible that Jesus still acts this way today? Have you ever been in a situation or witnessed a situation where people were anxiously awaiting God to show up and to save them? And their faith was in the right place. They knew that they needed God, but God seemed to be delaying. Why might he do that? Well, if he still acts in the same kind of pattern, it may be that he's delaying so that the greater salvation can be observed. Right? The more astounding salvation can be observed through his deliverance later on, when the situation appears to be darker and worse, rather than if he did it earlier on. So just something to consider when we go through or observe people in trials in life. So that's all I have for Mark chapter 5. Trying to shorten these videos up. I know we're still close to an hour. I'm going to try to continue to bring that down. But thanks everybody for watching. Remember, notes, book, down in the description. In the links, we'll do Mark chapter 6 in 2 days if God wills, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.